And so you're all here. Welcome to Monday Talmud with Rabbi Goodman. It's great to see you all. This week's section is page 31b. If you're scoring at home, if you're doing the Safaria, it starts at 31b, note 13. I'll just say a quick review. We don't have to look at it. There are 9 takanot of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai after the destruction of the temple. 9 changes that he made to Jewish law. And most of them are very specific, like they're persnickety. They're really small. They don't seem to be broad, grand changes, which is really interesting. We're in the middle of arguing about what the 9th one is. And last week, we spent a lot of time looking at option 1, option A. Let's unnumerate it and turn it into letters, alphabetize it. Objection A, Aleph, is that is about what the techum, what the boundary is of where one would be within the suburbs of Jerusalem and would be obligated to bring literal grapes to the temple in the 4th year, in the first year that they were permitted to be tithed. Versus if one lived outside of the suburbs of Jerusalem and could not be obligated to bring the actual grapes that one harvested from one's grapevine itself, but rather instead would be allowed to bring money as a exchange. And the boundaries were enumerated. Lod to the west, basically the Dead Sea to the east of the Jordan River, as it's described. A town called Eilat in the north, which we know is not actually Eilat, because we all know that Eilat is actually the big Eilat that we all know today, with the vacation restaurants and the diving, is to the south. And the 120-degree baking on the beach during the summer, as I did. I worked for Kibbutz Yahel for a whole summer, and we did 6 trips to Eilat, where everyone else went to the beach, and I had to grill hot dogs and hamburgers for everybody. Yeah, when my time at the kibbutz was over after working for them all summer, they handed me 120 shekel and put me on a bus. It was fantastic. But anyways, I did my duty for the Jewish people by melting in a parking lot in Eilat. And then in the south, they enumerated another city that we've never heard of before. So those were the boundaries. And what we know from that is the boundaries were actually like a day's walk in all directions. In fact, they were potentially more than a day's walk. So that's where the boundary gets laid down. That's Takana 9A. We're now going to spend our time this morning looking at Takana 9B. I also scanned for you all. We've been talking about temple-y things for like months, and I haven't shown you guys a diagram of the temple in forever. And this one is, I thought it was worthwhile of explaining what they're talking about in a slightly more explicit way, mostly because they were talking about a part of the temple that I didn't really know anything about, and I'm a rabbi. So my assumption is my understanding of the temple complex is supposed to be better than all of yours, and if I've never heard of it, then you've never heard of it. So by that level of reasoning, I thought I should look this up. Yeah, my skill in this class is not being able to read Steinsaltz aloud to you in English, because you don't need me for that. My skill is hopefully to be able to provide you with additional information that will clarify the page beyond what the page itself says. Otherwise, all of you will quit and just read Steinsaltz on your own, at your own time, at your own brisk pace, so that you could get through this tractate faster than we do. But what fun would that be, right?
Exactly. This is a lot more fun.
That's what I think. By the way, Israelis, I will be in Israel this summer in August. So I should try and figure out a way to come and visit you all.
Come to Kamiah.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it. So, all right. But that has nothing to do with this class. Here we go. I'm going to share the screen. And hopefully that will all work out well. Great. We're on, like I said, 31b, Safaria subnote 13. Noreen, you're my first window in the box. Do you mind reading this in the English? I'll do this is a Baraita, and it's all in Hebrew. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Lashon shel Zehirut d'Tanya, Barshona hayu koshrin, Lashon shel Zehirut al petach ulam mi bachutz, Hilbin hayu smechim, lo hilbin hayu atzuvim, hitkinu sheyu koshrin oto al petach ulam mi bifnim.
Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, the ordinance was with regard to the strip of crimson wool used on Yom Kippur. As it is taught in a Baraita, at first they would tie a strip of crimson wool to the opening of the entrance hall of the temple on the outside. If after the sacrificing of the offerings and the sending of the scapegoat, the strip turned white, the people would rejoice, as this indicated that their sins had been atoned for. If it did not turn white, they would be sad. When the sages saw that people were overly distressed on Yom Kippur, they instituted that they should tie the strip of crimson wool to the opening of the entrance hall on the inside, where only a few could enter to see it.
Okay, so this is all weird, and so we'll break it down. So first of all, for basic understanding, which I think all of you know, but it should be said just in case, there is this ritual on Yom Kippur of the scapegoat, right? It's enumerated in the Talmud, in the Torah itself, right? The priest would take, and it's in Vayikra, it's in Leviticus, and in fact, it was in last week's Torah portion, not the one we did on Shabbat, but the one we did the Shabbat before this last Shabbat. It's in Achrei Mot. So the priest takes 2 goats, they draw lots, right? They basically, like, you know, maybe they blindfold him and they switch his hands or something, or maybe they give him some dice and he, you know, rolls 7 come 11. Daddy needs a new pair of shoes, right? No. And one goat is slaughtered as an offering, and the other one is set free. Okay. And the idea is that the goat
Banished into the wilderness. It's
Yeah.
not just
set free into the wilderness. Thank you for correcting it. But it's returned to nature, right? And the idea is that the sacrifice is atoned for the sins. By the way, America, we have the exact same process. The president gets 2 turkeys on the day before Thanksgiving and pardons one and eats the other, right? And if you ever want a great episode of TV, there's a good old West Wing with the turkeys and the pardoning of the turkeys. Okay, so I have to wonder whether they didn't completely borrow that ritual from the Bible. I'm really interested in wondering if they came up with that here. But apparently, in addition to that, they would take Lashon Shel Zehirut, tongue of crimson thread, and tie it to the outside of what is here called the ulam. Now, an ulam in modern Hebrew, I always think of it in translation as an auditorium. It's just a large space which holds people. We had an ulam at Ramat Darom. It was a semi-outdoor space. There is at CDS, there is an ulam klali, like a general auditorium space, which is AKA the place where the kids pray, where they have meetings, sometimes classes. It's also the cafeteria, right? Or as my boss at the day school in Denver used to refer to it, a cafechapanasium. My congregation in Erie has a proper cafechapanasium, which is the social hall, which also has a stage, which also has basketball nets on either side of it. At Beth Shalom, we have a cafechapanasium in the basement, but we actually have our nasium up on the 4th floor and our cafechapanel down in the basement, which is also known as the Salmon Mini Hyman Ballroom, which has a stage, but also is good for Kiddush, but also we pray down there. So that's sort of what a modern ulam is in modern Hebrew. You'll see that it is very different. It's just, for the Israelis out there, do you know the word ulam to mean anything other than what I just described it as?
Yeah, the place in the movie theater where you watch the movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a whole, yeah. Ulam
Yeah.
koncertim, ulam
Yeah.
for weddings, for catering.
Yeah, Olam is a hall. It's just a
Any
hall.
big
That's
hall.
all it means. It just
Yeah.
means
Yeah.
hall. That's good, but it's not like a hallway. It's not like it's
No,
not
no,
it's a
no.
hall,
Right.
It's
large
a hall
hall.
where people can gather.
right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's interesting. I guess then the modern Hebrew is somewhat taking it from what we're about to look at. So the question that I'm kind of bringing up is okay, last piece about this paragraph, clearly it required a lot of explanation. The last piece I'll say about this paragraph is they're talking about this space, the ulam, and clearly, if the red strip of wool would turn white, it indicated that God forgave them. And if it turned red, God did not forgive them. And apparently it was very distressing to the people. They kind of waited outside like you do outside the Vatican to find out if there's a new pope, right? If the smoke turns black, if the smoke is black, no pope. If the smoke is white, we have a pope, right? So red, not atoned, white, atoned, right? It's very similar. But the people would freak out if it didn't turn colors. So what they decided to do was, instead of having it posted on the ulam outside, they tucked it away so that it was on the inside of the opening. And so people wouldn't know whether they had been atoned for, which begs the question, why do they do this at all? My assumption is that somewhere in the Mishnah, it is obligated, right? This was a thing that was required. And so they couldn't get rid of it, but they also didn't want to freak people out by making them do this. The intricacies, the massive amount of information around the temple ritual, which we no longer practice, goes on and on and on and on and on. There is a very good reason why we don't study all of the obligations of ritual purity and ritual impurity in modern Jewish Talmud classes, because it's very, very intricate and also very, very dull, right? And completely irrelevant. There is nothing that applies. So it's always interesting to study something that has no modern application today, and ask the question, is there anything we can do with it? So I'm going to share with you again a different thing. I'm going to share with you a screen that is a picture. We'll do two pictures. Is that the right one? That is the right one. Good. So this is from the Steinsaltz reference guide. This handy book, which I highly recommend you owning. It's a really good one. Adin Steinsaltz and his people put together an English translation explanation of all of the background concepts that you would need to be good at Talmud. It's 300 pages long. I would say to some degree that you kind of have to commit this book to memory by the time you become a rabbi. Some of it you already know, by the way. Olivia has a question. Go ahead, Olivia, or a comment.
Yeah, I was wondering if the Lashon Shel Zahari is related to like Madonna's red string of Kabbalah.
Ooh, what a good question. I don't know. But if it were...
The other thing I'm thinking about is like when the baby Perez comes out, right?
Yeah.
In the Tamar story.
Yeah.
Or and they put a red string around that kid's wrist for.
That's right.
Heaven understands why.
There's also the red string associated with Rachel's Keva.
Oh, very good. I kind of asked the question. So the word lashon kind of, can be a string, but could also be like a bunch of strings, because the Mishnah also regards it in that way. There are two other colors that are associated with the temple. One is argaman, and one is techelet. And why? Another question that one might ask about the Kabbalah Learning Center is why not techelet or why not argaman? And why Zehirut instead? So Techelet is like a blue, and Argaman is a purple, as far as we know, anyways. Although there are arguments that Techelet was properly purple back in the day, and that we've been getting it wrong ever since. Go ahead, Marion.
Yeah, they say that Techelet came from a particular snail or something.
Yeah, I have it on my tzitzit, which is at work. All right, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that the idea of the transition from crimson to white is also part of the liturgy during the high holidays. High holidays, when we say that if our sins, we quote from the Bible, if their sins are like crimson, they will be turned white as snow.
Nice.
And so that's also the idea.
Nice.
That's a
Mhm.
reification of that concept.
Great. I somewhere rattling around in the back of my head that existed, but sometimes I think that I make things up and then I don't say them out loud so that I don't. But I think all the things that you brought in here are really valuable. And I think on a meta question, like asking this question of like, what does it mean to the people to have a visual image of atonement, right? To know like you're clean, right? You walk away. When we walk away from Yom Kippur, we have to rely on our own spiritual intuition, I suppose is the phrase that I would use, that we're good now, like everything's fine. But we don't necessarily know for a fact that it is that way. But the inverse is also possible, which is like, what if we were told you're atoned, we come to atone and you look at the thing and the crimson doesn't turn to white and you say to yourself, wow, the Jewish people are not atoned for the coming year. What earthquake, hurricane, tornado, lightning strike, volcano are we gonna experience because we weren't atoned for? That's a very bad feeling. Going into the new year with a feeling of dread does not feel like a good spiritual process for me. Mark, go ahead.
I have a great idea for your sanctuary that you have and Beth Shalom sanctuary. The exit signs are always in red, and like after the Yom Kippur service, they can turn white, and then people will say, "Wow, we're atoned."
Yeah, what a great idea! Currently, we're installing. My running joke at Beth Shalom has been currently we're installing a water feature in the hallway up to the second floor. And
no, that is not funny. That's been there for years. That is not funny.
It's worse now, though. It used to just be a little leak that we would put a bucket under, and the leak has turned into a flow. And this week they put 2 tarps and a trash can underneath it because it rained really heavily here in Pittsburgh for 3 straight days.
And the hell font's been flooded on occasion too, but not recently.
Yeah. So
they can't find the leak.
Sure. Well, they could just fix the roof, but that would be expensive. All right, let's talk about the picture that I showed here. But anyways,
so nobody has an answer about a Kabbalistic. The closest I can think of Kabbalistically connection is that Zaharit is the same root as the Zohar, like the Book of Splendor.
Yeah, very interesting. Zahir. Very good. I'd never thought of that. I actually don't really understand. There are certain terms that kind of are fungible in multiple ways, and I don't know them. And Zohar is one of them. I always knew Zohar as bright, or glowing as the translation.
I think it can also mean to warn.
Yeah, it also means that, which is right. The Lashon Zehirut also would literally translate as a string of warning, right? Which makes perfect sense here. All right, let's talk about the space, though. If you look at the thing that I've shared screen with for the last 5 minutes that we haven't actually talked about, you see an overhead view of the temple complex. I want you to note, first of all, it's oriented west is at the top and east is at the bottom, which is really interesting because I never think of it that way. At the bottom is what is referred to that the whole giant square with the 4 corners in it is referred to as the Ezrat Nashim, the women's courtyard. It's not for women per se, or when I say it's not for women, it's not for women exclusively. It's a courtyard in which any non-Kohen or Levi is permitted to gather. And effectively, this was a public gathering space, probably mostly for the purpose of being the place where people would gather for big moments, for big speeches, for big ritual events, because it's inside the temple complex and in view of the temple, but outside of where the Kohanim and Leviim do their thing. There are 4 corners to that. They are the 4 chambers: the chamber of the Nazirite, of the oils, of the lepers, and of the wood. I think one eventually became the chamber of the Sanhedrin. I think one of them switched. I think maybe it's the Nazir, but I'm not sure. But that becomes later on. So remember, the temple existed for 400 years and then was, off for 70, and then exists for another 500 years, roughly. And so some of these, so this is, by the way, a plan of the second temple, not of the first temple. The first temple probably looked different and didn't have all of these cool bells and whistles. And the second temple probably, you also probably could intuit that like the second temple probably changed through time also, right? Herod came in and made a lot of changes to the temple, and his temple only stood for roughly 40 years, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe not even that long. So that's all kind of important and notable. All right, anyhow, so what are we talking about? So if you look at the upper half, you see the overhead view, that like structure in the middle. So 41, if you look at the number 40 and 41, that's the thing that we almost always talk about in Judaism. That is the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant, right? Then there's a curtain, and then there's a foreroom. And that whole building complex structure there is called the Heichal. In translation, it would be called the palace. But when we talk about the Heichal and the principle of the temple, we're just talking about kind of the inner chamber, right? The main space, which was only for the highest of the Kohanim. They did the showbread in that room. They brought certain offerings. That's where the menorah was. That's where the eternal light was, right? And then there's a space that I've literally never thought about before. It's marked numerically as number 32, and it's circled in blue, and it's called the Ulam. Right? It's the hall, or the better translated here, they call it the entrance hall. And it has a series of steps up to it. And this is where we're talking about, that there would have been outside of the kind of outer hall, which as far as I know, I don't know of any purpose that it serves, except to be its space where the Kohanim would kind of line up the ones that have to go in and do their job in the Heichal. And it's just an entrance space. On either side, there's something called the Chamber of Knives, which, I've studied a lot of Talmud. I've never heard of it. I have no idea what it functions as. I can assume what it does, since it's the place that, since you have to do a lot of slaughters, you would need to store some knives somewhere. So remember, the temple was a working space, right? It needed a place for wood, a place for oil, a place to mix the incense, a place to clean the knives, a place to dump out the ashes. It needed a whole intricate water system to wash the altar, right? Like, it was a real functioning space. So I think we often think of it as this like magical holy place but like, just like a modern synagogue today, like there needs to be a room to stash the clergy's robes. There needs to be a room to put the buckets and the mops, right? Like the temple had all that stuff. It had like closets and things like that. 27 and 26 are notable because of the altar. 7 is notable because there's this place where the priest would stand, and they had musical instruments. And I think it had like 21 steps, and the 21 steps corresponds to 21 lines, or maybe it's 22, I forget, in one of the Psalms. And they used to sing or play one of these Psalms musically while singing it on those steps, which are marked number 7, the stairs leading to the Israelite courtyard. So anyways, if you're wondering, that's where this is. I'm going to stop share so I can switch this view so that you can see what this looked like outside. You Israelis probably recognize this. This is not mini Israel. This is the Second Temple model, which I believe used to be located at the Holy Land Hotel, or it was, I can tell you that, because we stayed there once. And me and a buddy tried to sneak in one night. We had this is a true story. We had a handful of army men, and we were gonna, and little toys, and we were gonna place it on the Second Temple model at like 1 o'clock in the morning. And we got to the Second Temple model, and there was a guard house, and there was a guy at the guard house. And I said, "Hey, we were out taking a walk. What are you doing here?" And he looked at us, no joke, this is a true story. He looked at us and says, trying to keep people like you away from the model. So we did not get to play. We were going to play Godzilla. We were going to march all over the temple thing, but we were not allowed to. So the army men went right back. By the way, if you're asking a question, how old was I when I was doing this? 25. I was 25 years old when I was it's not like a thing of little kids. It was me and a fellow rabbinical student at a retreat at the Holy Land Hotel. As far as I know, they moved this, I think, to the Israel Museum. I think it sits in the Israel Museum.
It's outside the Israel Museum.
Yeah, because for whatever reason.
That's where.
By the way, the question of why did a local second-rate hotel in Jerusalem have an entire model of the old city of Jerusalem as of the year 60 of the Common Era? I have no idea. I think they built it as a tourist attraction to get people to come to the hotel. But it's kind of random. It's like, it's like if Minio's here in Pittsburgh also had a whole diorama of Pittsburgh in 1835. It's like, why not? We're Minio's, we do what we want. It's like Randyland. It was kind of like Randyland. Okay, anyways, one last thing, and then Renee, you can comment. We are talking, so it's hard to kind of visualize this. Here is the door to the Ulam. This little square, I don't know if you guys can see this little, my pointer moving. I hope you can. Yeah. This little area up here is the kind of shows you the dimensions of where the Ulam was. It's just this front space. And you can kind of see by scale, these doors would have been like 30 feet high. So you can kind of understand that the Ulam was like 200 feet long, right? This is a big space. All of this, by the way, is King Herod's temple. The temple was much more humble in the pre-Herodian era, and the first temple was even more humble. It was much smaller. It was much lower. It wasn't made out of marble and stone. It didn't have all of these extra dimensions and so on. All right, Renee, go ahead.
You're muted.
She's getting there.
Okay, I'm just trying to see. I can't find a picture for myself. But this is a piece that was done. Can you see it?
Yeah.
This is a piece that was done by the gentleman who owned that hotel.
Oh, wow.
We called him the Stone Man. He was a friend of my family's, and he gave us this in one of our trips. Mm-hmm. And some of the stones were taken from Egypt when he served in the army. But he used to make these as well as the replica of the temple, mm-hmm. which I guess you mentioned was moved to the History Museum.
Yeah. Very cool.
So I thought I would just share it with you.
Very cool. The last thing I'll say is you'll notice, so this is, you have to imagine you're facing west. So the lower retaining wall of the temple complex that we pray to now as the Kotel Ma'aravi, the Western Wall, is down here. It's basically down below this outer kind of courtyard thing. This outer courtyard thing, I think, was expanded to at some point much later because of the demands of all the pilgrims coming. And so they all probably couldn't fit in here. But this is this entire kind of upper temple complexy area that we now know as the Dome of the Rock and the Haram al-Sharif. And it is referred to in modern English as the El Aqsa Temple Complex. But there are three things up on that space right now. One is the Dome of the Rock itself, and one is a giant mosque. In fact, the mosque is much larger than the Dome of the Rock. And I've been in both, because back in the 90s, you could go up there without creating an international incident. Today, you're going to create an international incident if you go up there. So, all right, enough about the temple. Back to the Talmud. So that's where they would tie the string of red on the outside. And the question is, this is argument 9b, right? This is like, oh, this is the thing that this is what the rabbis are going to describe as the other gezerah of the other takana, legal decision of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. All right, with that, let's keep going. Paula, you're up in my window, so you get the next one. Va'adayin hayu matzitzin v'ro'in hilbin. Hayu smechim, lo hilbim, hayu atzuvim. Hitkinu shiyu koshrim oto, chetzio besela, v'chetzio bein karnav, shel seir hamishtalech.
But people would still peek and see it. And once again, if it turned white, they would rejoice. And if it did not turn white, they would be sad. Therefore, the sages instituted that they should tie half of the strip to a rock near the place where the one who sent the scapegoat stood, and half of it between the horns of the scapegoat, so that the people would not know what happened to the strip until after the conclusion of Yom Kippur. This ordinance was instituted by Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Okay, so what is the takana of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, or as I'm referring to it, takana 9b? And the answer is people were still peeking, right? So they would actually tie it to the horn of the scapegoat so that you wouldn't know what happened to it till after Yom Kippur was over, right? Let's all not worry about the scapegoat during the holiday. Let's worry about it after the big reveal. It's an interesting thing, pretty esoteric and strange to try and figure out what's going on here. I think the ritual of the scapegoat by itself is esoteric and strange, right? We've got this whole idea of being atoned based on the performance of a pair of goats, which feels very pre-modern, right? Can you imagine, I mean, no joke, folks. Can you imagine if I brought barnyard animals into the sanctuary at Beth Shalom and said, this is a major part of our spiritual ritual on this, our holiest day? We've been theming our Friday night kids service, and our assistant director of the preschool, Pam Stossela, has been very helpful in coming up with really cool creative names for these things. So this week it's Mother's Day in the United States, or yesterday it was. So we called the kids service on Friday Shababa Mama and Shababa Abba. The reason is the real original Friday night name of the service was Shababa Baba. Why is it called Shababa Baba? I have no idea. These are just traditions we inherit from our forebears. But anyways, Shababa Baba, which has been around for 7 or 8 years, we've been playing with the names. And I said, you know what we should do? We should have Shababa Llama, right? We should have a day where we bring a llama, and the kids, it'll be petting zoo, Shababa Baba, and the kids will have a good old time. And I think I was serious in saying we should bring a llama into the ballroom, the salmon mini ballroom. Paul is looking at me no, that's a bad idea, Rabbi. Having a llama.
They bite and they spit, and they're going to hurt the kids. It's not.
Well,
safe.
no, you keep them nice and you
Anesthetized.
Yeah,
I think
they
right,
don't spit as bad as camels, but they do spit.
Yeah, they do.
I've heard that before, but we're gonna see. But we're not gonna bring it into the ballroom. But anyways,
And Billy won't want to clean up the poop.
goats are not much.
They're also not toilet trained.
No, my point is this: goats are not much better, right? But this was a critical part, and we bring these goats into the holiest place in Judaism, right? The temple. And there's no strange contradiction to this. So when I say this ritual is strange and esoteric and nonsensical and bizarre, I mean it, right? This is a weird thing, but if you go back to that thing before, there were animals all over because you were bringing them up to the altar to slaughter them, right? There's a lot of poop and pee and blood and guts and animals and noise and fur at the temple. And it's the holiest space in Judaism. This is weird, right? We need to sometimes stop and look at the contradictions in our own religion that say that we never stop to think of, to point out this is weird, but it's holy and it's supposed to be there. All right, onward. Let's keep thinking about this and chew through this because we want to make some forward progress today. Ellie Sheva, do me a favor and you read this big chunk of English for me, okay?
Okay, let me just let my dog outside.
Speaking of animals interfering with our spiritual work, very good. right. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. My time. So this is Aramaic. My time lo amar krav papa. Kerav papa. Amalach. Isakadatach Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Chave Rav de Rebbe Eliezer mihavi. Rabo havi. Ve'idach. Kevan de Talmidim haviu. Lav orach ara lememra le lerabe rabach. Go ahead.
The Gemara explains this dispute. What is the reason that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak did not state his opinion with regard to the ordinance in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa? He could have said to you, if it enters your mind to say that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai rescinded the ordinance of the fruit of fourth-year grapevines, was he one of Rabbi Eliezer's colleagues that the students would have referred to him in this manner? He was his teacher. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan cannot be the one who instituted this ordinance. And the other, Rav Papa, what would he respond to this? He would say that since they were Rabbi Eliezer's students, it is not proper conduct for one to say to his teacher, your teacher. Therefore, they referred to Rabbi Yochanan as Rabbi Eliezer's colleague.
Okay, this is a very classic piece of Gemara reasoning. The rabbis are trying to figure out which of these two was actually the ordinance of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Somehow we know there are 9. Somehow we have 10, right? And for some reason, we know that this was the one which was questionable. So they try and do a little bit of logic to figure out whether which one of these two was the 9th. The first one is we find out who is holding by which of the opinions. It is Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's opinion that it's that the thing that we are arguing about is the crimson thread. That's that 9b, the crimson thread, is the correct takana. That's the 9th, right? And it is Rav Papa's opinion that it is the disagreement about the boundary of Jerusalem with regard to tithing of the 4th year of grapes, okay? What's the logic that each one applies in order to get to where they're going? The logic of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is that the statement regarding the grapes lumps Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai in as this is a statement of Rabbi Eliezer's colleagues, which was a thing that we read last week. That's a mention there, okay? And the problem with, and it says like, oh, that's the opinion, and that the Baraita there implies that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is holding by the opinion of, quote unquote, his colleagues, or the colleagues of Rabbi Eliezer. The problem with that is, according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is not one of Rabbi Eliezer's colleagues. He's one of his teachers, right? And so it would have never been referred to in this way. And therefore, the proper answer for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is that this is not a takana of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, but rather a statement by Rabbi Eliezer and his colleagues, which is not the takana, right? And therefore, the correct answer by deductive reasoning, right? That 9a cannot be the right answer, and therefore 9b is the right answer, okay? That's Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's answer up ahead, okay? The response is Rav Papa's, which is since they were Rabbi Eliezer's students, it is not proper conduct to say of his teacher, your teacher. Basically, it's a fudge, right? He's like, well, you wouldn't have, it was a takana of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, but it was a team effort. But you would never say that it was a team effort from his colleagues, because that would be insulting to the teacher, right? It's as if you were at Carnegie Mellon or Pitt or the Technion for you in Israel, and your graduate assistant came up with a brilliant solution to a problem and you wrote it into your paper, right? You would mention your graduate assistant, but you wouldn't mention your graduate assistant on the same level as the professor, right? The professor would draw the final credit. And therefore, it is possible that 9a, the argument about the grapevines, is the right answer. That's Rav Papa's opinion. Okay. Does everyone follow? If you didn't, that's okay. This is one of those intricate, this is one of those classic pieces of Gemara where you're juggling 5 or 6 balls in the air at one time, and you don't necessarily need to hold this in order to go on. Sometimes, by the way, I'll just be very honest. I take these and I go, I don't know what's going on, right? Like there's an argument here. Rabbis, I do understand this one, but I will come clean and admit that I don't always understand when they get really, really into the weeds like this. All right, but they're not going to stop, which is the fun. All right, Renee, you're the next box up on my screen, and you're still here, so I'm going to have you read if it's okay by you. V'Rav Papa my taima. So we're going to get the counter argument. Rav Papa my taima. What's the reason? La Amar Karav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Amar Lach. Isal Kedatach Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, B'Yamei Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Mi Havi Loshon Shel Zehirut, V'Hatanya, Kol Shinotav Shel Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Mea ve'esrim Shana, Arbaim Shana, Asak be'Firak Matya, Arbaim Shana Lamad, Arbaim Shana Limed.
The Gemara asks, and what is the reason that Rav Papa did not state his opinion in accordance with the opinion of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak? Rav Papa could have said to you, if it enters your mind to say that the ordinance from Yom Kippur was instituted by Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai in the days of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was there. In fact, a strip of crimson wool, isn't it taught in a Baraita? All the years of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's life were 120 years. 40 years he was involved in business so that he could achieve financial independence and study Torah. 40 years he studied Torah, and 40 years he taught Torah.
Very good. All right, so I think we accidentally learned an interesting thing about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai here, but I don't know that we get a lot of forward motion on this disagreement. The disagreement is the Talmud, the omniscient editorial voice of the Talmud, which was codified in 476, so roughly the era of the Talmudic kind of figuring out was from the mid 300s to the mid 400s in Babylonia, comes up with a counter argument that Rav Papa might have used, which is one could say that this ordinance of Yom Kippur was instituted in the time of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and that there was time where Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai would have done it the original way and where he would have modified things. And now he's saying, well, okay, now the Talmud is kind of asking a question. When would this have been instituted? And so it breaks Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's life into 3 phases, right? Phase 1, and here's an interesting word, is he was asak befragmatia, which there's a lot of Greek loan words into Hebrew, especially in the Talmudic era. I am going to go out on a limb and say the word phragmatia sounds suspiciously like pragmatism or pragmaticness, right? And it's being translated here as business, right? I like that you got to be pragmatic as a rabbi and have a real job before you switch over, right? I was a ski instructor and a waiter at a Chinese restaurant. I don't know how pragmatic that was, especially since in New Mexico, in the year that I lived there, the hourly wage for tipped employees the year that I worked there was $2.15 an hour. Not so pragmatic, Rabbi Goodman. But anyways,
it used to be $1.25.
$1.25, nothing, right? Just terrible.
Yeah, Klein Etymological Dictionary would agree with you about the
in New York in the 60s, it was $1.25.
Cool. Yes, lower minimum wage for tipped labor is awful. This is my editorial comment for the day. And Olivia, you said that you pulled something up that said that phragmatia and pragmatism seem to jibe. But anyways, so
Yeah, you
learned
could
that-
swap out the kuf for gimel. It's apparently spelled either way.
right. That's a thing. If you go through whatchamacallit, Jastro, the Jastro dictionary, you'll see a lot of Greek words kind of get, and I think we can understand that as they were borrowing words that came, across the ocean. So if they got them wrong, it was because that it was Israelis trying to, or Palestinian Jews trying to figure out what Greek sailors were saying, and they were transposing kufs and gimels. Okay. Anyhow, so we learned that he studies Torah for 40 years, and then he taught it for 40 years. So I think what we're intuiting here is he didn't institute any gezerot until those final 40 years of his life. All right, let's keep moving and see what other kind of logical objections we get out of this. Olivia, do you mind reading this in the English for us? V'hatanya arba'im shana kodem shenecha Rav habayit lo haya lashon shel zehirut malbin ela ma'adim utnan mi shecharav habayit hitkin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai v'idach otam arba'im shana delamad Talmud Yoshev Lifnei Rabo Hava, V'amar Milta V'istabar Tamai.
As it is taught in a Baraita, during the 40 years before the second temple was destroyed, the crimson strip of wool would not turn white. Rather, it would turn a deeper shade of red. We learned in the Mishnah, when the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted his ordinances. This shows that Rabbi Yochanan lived and taught Torah after the destruction. Therefore, the ordinance of the crimson wool must have been made while Rabbi Yochanan was still studying Torah before he instituted any ordinances. Gemara asks, and the other sage, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, what would he answer? Like, how would he defend his opinion? According to him, the ordinance was instituted during those 40 years that he studied Torah. He was a student sitting before his teacher, and he said a matter, meaning he suggested this ordinance. His reasoning made sense to the sages.
We'll get there in a second. Let's see if we can unpack this a little bit. It's
this is great. This is a reverse.
Yeah. So
in the Rav Papa, he was taking the opinion of his student and integrating it. And in the Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak example, he was a student whose teacher integrated his thing.
Very nice. Well said, Olivia. I think you got that better than I would have. Let's just go back a step to just pointing out that like they're pinning this opinion on kind of a timeliness argument, which is that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was instituting this decree after the temple was destroyed, which is interesting because then the decree that he laid down would have never had any practical application because there was no ulam to affix the crimson wool to in order to, so it's theoretical in nature, right? But it also implies a second thing, which is the goal of putting this of the decrees down was that it applied when the temple would be rebuilt, right? Which also shows us that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai very strongly believed that the temple was going to be rebuilt. I don't know if it was going to be in his time or afterwards. But anyhow, you're right, Olivia, that this has to do with kind of an inverse of the logic about whether your students are around you or not in order to prove your point. But it's an attempt for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak to kind of like make his point about the grapevine piece by invalidating the argument of argument 9b, the argument around the tongues of crimson wool, the strings of crimson wool. And the final line here, V'kave Rabbe Dishme, and his teacher established it in his name. Consequently, and this is so to Olivia's point, to finish it off, consequently, it is counted as one of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's ordinances. We get a very rare kind of Talmudic moment where the Gemara has reasoned out an argument between two Tanaim and has assigned a winner, right? Usually in a Talmudic argument, we don't get clarity. So the funny thing about that is, what do we do with 9a? I assume that that means that 9a holds, but it's believed to be an institution by Rabbi Eliezer and not an institution of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. I assume that it means it still stands, but Olivia, you weren't here last week. We were talking about Rabbi Eliezer and Tanur Shalachnai. Generally, if we hold by one of the statements in the Tanur Shalachnai story, which is Bava Metzia 59, I think, what we learn from that is that Rabbi Eliezer's opinions are not held by. Now, you have to be kind of a Talmudic absolutist to say, if it's said over there kind of categorically, it really means categorically all over the Talmud that we always do it this way, which is not entirely true as far as I know. Just because it says in the Tanur Shalachnai story, we don't hold by any of the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer. If you went through all of the opinions in the Talmud, I believe you would find a number of places where the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer is the opinion that we still hold by. So I would guess. Oh, go ahead.
I thought we just didn't hold by Rabbi Eliezer in terms of purity and impurity after the Tanur Shalachnai.
Right. So that's the argument. That's another argument in the Talmud, which is in the Tanur Shalachnai story, it says, and they took all of his opinions on that day and they burned them. Right. And so there's to your point, Olivia, there is a disagreement, I believe, in the commentaries about whether the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer on ritual impurity are the ones that are burned, or whether it's all his opinions are burned. Okay. We leave off in an awkward place. I kind of thought that was as far as we were going to get, but we're going to keep getting, which is kind of exciting. We are at the top of page 32a. So mazel tov to everybody. Go ahead, Olivia.
Just wanted to reflect on the kind of kindness and respect of the way this plays out, where it's the opinions of students which are honored in their name, other than you might expect the professor to take credit for the student. And it really honor both opinions in their name.
That's beautiful. I like that. Thank you for adding that. I think that that's really valuable. And I think there's a tension in Judaism. There's a principle that you don't teach halacha lifnei rabo, before your rabbi. An opinion which is not held too frequently at Kiddush at Beth Shalom, in people lecturing me about certain things that they think I need to do or believe, which is fine. It just means that I have to adopt I need to work harder to make them my student and for me to be their Rav. But also, we live in a postmodern 21st century society where I am you all know me well enough to know that I am way of the opinion that, like, nobody needs to listen to anything I have to say, right? I present Jewish wisdom to you, and you can take it or leave it. If I'm not compelling, leave it, right? So back then, there was a very strong sense that, like, you held by your Rav, and you would never presume to teach halacha in front of them. But here, to Olivia's point, the opinions of the students are integrated into the values and the thoughts of the teacher. So it's really nice. All right, from here, we're going to get back on track or get back off track, depending on how you look at it, and move forward with a Mishnah. We only have a few minutes, so I don't know how deep we're going to get into this, and that is okay, right? We will just be left where we are. I don't remember if Cindy has gotten a chance to read English. Cindy, will you do me the honor of reading us the English here as we do the Mishnah on the top of page 32a. Matnitin, Seder Brachot, Omer Avot Ugvurot Ukrishat Hashem, V'cholel Malchuyot Imahem, Ve'eno Tokea.
So the order of blessings of the additional prayer on Rosh Hashanah is as follows. One recites the blessing of the patriarchs, the blessing of God's mighty deeds, and the blessing of the sanctification of God's name, all of which are recited all year long. And one includes the blessing of kingship, containing many biblical verses on that theme with them. In other words, in the blessing of sanctification of God's name, and he does not sound the shofar after it.
Okay, so
It's
we
pretty
are
specific.
yeah, we are at the very, very end of the last chapter of Talmud Rosh Hashanah, right? And we have been studying Talmud Rosh Hashanah forever, for 4 years, right? And in the 4 years of studying Talmud Rosh Hashanah, we have dealt with lots of esoteric principles. We've even gotten into very persnickety, that's the second time I've used that word today, issues around whether you can repair a shofar and whether you could blow a shofar inside a cistern, and whether the echo of the person of hearing it outside of the cistern counts as a shofar, and whether a person who didn't intend to hear the shofar can fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the shofar, or whether they might think it's a, right? We've gotten into the weeds for years about all sorts of matters. And suddenly, all of a sudden, 3 pages from the end of the Talmud, they say, all right, here's the blessings that we do on Rosh Hashanah, right? You would think this is the most important stuff, but they only get to it at the end. Maybe it's important and they do get to it at the end, or maybe they're kind of implying that, but this is a great lesson in Talmud, right? The Talmud is teaching you that the argument and the intricacy and the details are far more interesting to them than the broad strokes, right? But we just learned another thing that I think we just picked out of here, which is interesting, is when the rabbis, the thing that we all know as the Avot Nimahot, the Givurot, and the Kedusha, they called it that 2,000 years ago, right? This is the terminology that was used back then, and Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot also, okay? And then what we really learned, the only thing that we've really learned here that's that kind of revelatory, is that, we do the Seder Shofar, the Seder Tikiyot, after we read from the Torah, we blow shofar, right? And then in Musaf, there are 3 little breaks between after Malchuyot, after Zichronot, and after Shofarot, in which in modern times, we blow shofar, right? And we do it enough so that we make 100 blasts. Here, we are told we do not blow the shofar after Malchuyot, or at least what we are calling Malchuyot as it stands. We know from at least what we do today that this isn't the way we do things. So we're going to be kind of in suspense as to figuring out why this is the case for why we do things here. All right, let's read a little bit further. We'll read through these 2 paragraphs. We will not discuss them at all, and then we will call it a day, because these are the 2 paragraphs. We'll finish out our Mishnah. Cindy, you want to do one more for us?
Sure, why
Great.
not?
Kedushat hayom v'tokea, zichronot v'tokea, shofarot v'tokea, v'omar omer avoda v'hoda'a u'birkat kohanim, divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri.
All right, so next, one adds a special blessing for the sanctification of the day and sounds the shofar after it. What? Followed by the blessing of remembrances, which contain many biblical verses addressing that theme, and sounds the shofar after it, and recites the blessing of shofarot, which includes verses that mention shofar and sounds the shofar after it. And he then returns to the regular Amidah prayer and recites the blessing of God's service and the blessing of thanksgiving and the priestly blessing. This is the statement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri.
Great. So we have a minority opinion that holds that you don't blow the shofar after Malchuyot, but rather you blow it after Kedushat Hayom, right? Which is a prayer which shows up pretty much in every one of the festival holidays, in order to say, and we sanctify this day because it is this special day. And the order, by the way, is very familiar. It looks pretty much like the order that we do today, right? Modim is the Hoda'ah. Birkot HaKohanim is the Yevarechecha that you all know, and so on and so forth. They don't mention Sim Shalom here, but I assume that it either would have been there or it's appended as part of the Hoda'ah. Let's do one last line, and then we'll kind of, after we've got our feet in the Mishnah, we'll review it next week, and then we'll kind of grind away. Rich, do you mind reading this in the English for us?
Okay.
Cool. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, im eino tokea lamalchuyot, lama hu mazkir. Ela, omer avot ugvurot kedushat hayom, v'cholel malchuyot im kedushat hayom, vetokea, zichronot vetokea, shofarot vetokea, v'omer avodah v'hoda'a uvirchat kohanim.
Rabbi Akiva said to him, if one does not sound the shofar for the blessing of kingship, why does he mention it? Rather, the order of blessing of the blessings is as follows. One recites the blessing of the patriarchs and that of God's mighty deeds and that of the sanctification of God's name. He subsequently includes the blessing of kingship and the blessing of the sanctification of the day and sounds the shofar. Next, he recites the blessing of remembrances and sounds the shofar after it, and the blessing of shofarot and sounds the shofar after it. He then recites the blessing of God's service and the blessing of thanksgiving and the priestly blessing.
Great. So we've established in our Mishnah that there is a disagreement between two Tannaitic rabbis of the Mishnaic era about what is the exact way we do the shofar service in the Musaf, whether there is a blast after Malchuyot or whether Kedushat Hayom and Malchuyot are wrapped together and then the blast is done. Our exciting kind of, remember that for the next couple days, we'll probably wind up pulling us apart and arguing about which one is the right one and what is the logic behind each of these guys. And of course, we will go off topic and go into a different direction and start to figure out other things. But we're getting into a very interesting part of the Talmud where we're dealing with why do we say the prayers that we do on Rosh Hashanah? What is the meaning of them? And what is the logic behind doing them in a certain order or a certain way? That's all the time we have for this week. I will see you all next week on Monday. Bye-bye, everybody.